This is my ranking of new Souls-like games released in 2025 and 2026 that I've played based purely on my personal experience. Each one is placed from masterpiece down to trash, depending on how tight the combat feels, how well boss fights are designed, and how effectively each game balances challenge, exploration, and progression. Let's get straight into the list. Nioh 3 has some of the most satisfying combat I've played in any Souls-like during the last few years. The switch between samurai and ninja styles kept every fight exciting because I could play aggressively with fast attacks or slow things down with careful timing and defense. Boss fights were intense without feeling unfair, and the open areas made exploration feel much bigger than the earlier games. I also liked how many builds and weapon options the game gives you, since it constantly pushed me to try different approaches instead of sticking with a single setup. The story still felt weak compared to the combat, and the loot system became messy at times because of the huge amount of gear management. I think this lands easily in my masterpiece tier. First, Berserker Khazan started as a frustrating experience because the early bosses were extremely punishing, and I spent hours learning attack patterns just to survive. After pushing through those difficult opening sections, the combat slowly became far more rewarding since every dodge, guard, and counterattack demanded proper timing. I mainly stuck with the dual blades because the fast movement and aggressive playstyle made long fights feel intense from start to finish. Some later fights felt almost like long duels instead of normal boss battles. The mission structure felt a little repetitive at times, and the story never became very memorable, but the boss design kept raising the quality as the game progressed. Skill trees added variety without making combat systems feel overwhelming. Right now, this easily earns a place in my excellent tier. WUCHANG Fallen Feathers started strong with fast combat, great level design, and a dark fantasy atmosphere that kept becoming more unsettling as I progressed deeper into the world. I liked how flexible the combat felt because switching weapons and combining different abilities created a lot of variety during fights. The skill tree also stood out since it constantly unlocked new options instead of only increasing stats. Exploration stayed rewarding thanks to hidden paths, optional encounters, and interconnected areas that reminded me of older Souls-like level design. Some bosses became frustrating later because their attack windows felt extremely tight, which made certain fights drag longer than they should have. The story also became difficult to follow once more characters started appearing throughout the campaign. Even with those rough spots, this still settles nicely into my great tier. AI Limit had a few interesting ideas that helped it stand out slightly from other lower-budget Souls-likes, especially the sync rate system that rewarded aggressive combat without relying on a stamina bar. I also liked the anime-inspired art style and some of the faster fights against rival bladers because they demanded better timing and movement than most normal enemies. The problem was that much of the adventure felt repetitive after a while since enemy variety stayed limited and many bosses were far too easy to defeat. Several levels also felt empty, and the story never became engaging enough to carry the weaker sections. Technical issues made things worse because crashes and strange bugs happened more often than expected during my playthrough. Even though the combat had a few enjoyable moments, this still ends up sitting in my good tier. Elden Ring Nightreign felt completely different from a normal Souls-like because every run moved at a much faster pace and constantly pushed me to make quick decisions with my team. I liked how the game condensed progression into shorter sessions where weak starting builds slowly turned into powerful setups before the final boss fights. The Night Lord encounters were easily the highlight since many of them felt massive, chaotic, and designed around proper teamwork instead of simple one-on-one duels. I also enjoyed learning the map layouts, planning routes, and figuring out which encounters were worth risking before the circle closed in. Solo play definitely felt poorly balanced, and matchmaking frustrations sometimes ruined good runs when teammates were uncoordinated. Even with those problems, the combat, bosses, and co-op intensity were strong enough to place this straight into my masterpiece tier. Stellar Blade immediately stood out because the combat felt fast, responsive, and heavily focused on timing parries and dodges during aggressive enemy attacks. I liked how the game kept adding new mechanics throughout the campaign instead of relying on the same moves for the entire experience. Boss fights stayed exciting thanks to strong enemy variety, huge monster designs, and flashy abilities that made encounters feel intense without becoming overly complicated. Exploration was also rewarding since hidden upgrades, costumes, and optional fights gave me reasons to search every area carefully. The soundtrack added a lot during both combat and quieter moments, especially in some of the larger boss battles. The biggest weakness was easily the story because most characters felt forgettable, and many side quests became repetitive after a while. Even with those flaws, this still belongs in my excellent tier. Eyes of P Overture reminded me why I like the base game so much, because the expansion keeps the same strong combat, dark atmosphere, and memorable boss design while adding a lot of fresh content. The new areas were creative and unsettling, especially the sections filled with twisted animals and collapsing environments that constantly changed the pacing. Boss fights were the real highlight again, since they balanced aggressive attacks with patterns that stayed satisfying to learn after repeated deaths. I also liked how the story added more depth to the world and characters without making the pacing feel slow. Some locations and enemies reused ideas from the original game a little too often, and the combat system still pushes a specific playstyle instead of offering complete freedom. For me, this easily rises straight into my masterpiece tier. Another Crab's Treasure felt refreshing right away because it replaced the usual dark Souls-like atmosphere with colorful environments, funny characters, and creative underwater ideas that constantly made the adventure entertaining. I liked how the shell system changed combat and defense since every shell came with different abilities and encouraged experimenting during exploration and boss fights. The world design also stayed memorable because almost every area introduced some strange enemy, clever environmental detail, or funny joke that kept the pacing enjoyable from beginning to end. Combat was definitely simpler than most Souls-likes, and many bosses were easier than expected, but the creativity behind their designs still made fights enjoyable. A few camera problems and bugs occasionally became annoying during combat sections as well. Even with those rough spots, this easily swims its way into my excellent tier. The Bearer and the Last Flame started with a generic dark fantasy setup, but the real problems appeared once I began exploring and fighting enemies. The opening areas were extremely confusing because paths blended together, important routes were difficult to spot, and I spent huge amounts of time wandering in circles instead of making progress. Combat felt even worse since hitboxes were unreliable. Attacks missed for no clear reason, and movement during fights felt awkward and slippery. Performance on PS5 also caused constant issues with heavy screen tearing, stuttering, frame drops, and multiple crashes during my playthrough. I tried pushing deeper, hoping the later areas would improve things, but the second region became even more frustrating with messy layouts and unreliable encounters. At the end of it all, this settles into my mediocre tier. That's my full ranking of recent Souls-likes based on combat feel, boss quality, and overall design consistency. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you in the next one.